All right, well, I think we will get started here today. I am really pleased to introduce myself and my colleagues that have collaborated on this research with us. My name is Marisa Lenchi. I am a research associate at Accountability Council. We aim to amplify the voices of communities around the world to protect their human rights and environment. And as advocates for people harmed by internationally financed development projects, we employ community-driven and policy-level strategies to access justice. I've been working with Accountability Council for nearly 5 years now, contributing to research into the system of accountability and supporting communities seek redress from harm from development projects. I am joined today by my colleagues, Samer Arabi, our research director, and my fellow research associate, Lema Al-Muayyad, both at Accountability Council. And I will just briefly pass it over to Amy Ekdawi to introduce herself and her organization, the Our Watch Coalition.
Okay, hi everyone, and thanks for coming to this event. We are really very excited to present the findings and recommendations here. So I'm Amy Ekdawi. I'm the co-director of Arab Watch Coalition. I'm based in Washington, D.C. And I have been doing this work since 2007. And I'm with Arab Watch Coalition since the launching in 2018. And I'm joined also by my colleagues here. We have Shireen Talat, who is a co-director based in the region. And we have Imna Maraf, and Ibna is based in Tunisia. Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Amy. Once again, we just wanted to say thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We have participants from all around the world, and we're really grateful for your interest in this work. We're excited to discuss some of the findings and recommendations with all of you. In our webinar today, we will plan to talk through the barriers to community-led accountability and development finance in the Middle East and North Africa region. I'm going to start us off with a brief background of our research, walk through some of the data analysis that we conducted, and then we'll move to the findings that we observed through our interview processes with groups in the region. I'll then pass it over to Amy to speak further to some of the underlying barriers that communities and civil society groups face through IAM processes in the region. And then we'll hear from fellow civil society representative, Rajia El-Jarzawi of Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, on their ongoing case filed with the CAO about the Titan Alexandria cement project in Egypt. And then we'll close our presentation with some of the recommendations that we've designed to address the barriers for accountability offices and for development finance institutions. We will reserve the remainder of our time to open a discussion with all of you and hear any comments, feedback, questions that you have for us. We do ask that your microphone please remain muted during the course of the presentation, and we'll take live questions during the discussion section. That said, we do welcome you to use the chat and the Q&A functions on the Zoom channel throughout. And any questions submitted through the Q&A, we will aim to answer at the end of the presentation. We will be recording the presentation portion, and we'll be posting that on our website, as well as circulating it to all of our attendees afterward. The discussion section will be recorded only internally, just to facilitate any follow-up and continue the conversations that we anticipate beginning with all of you today. And with all of that said, I will get us started. This research focuses, as I said, on complaints about harm from international development projects. International development projects are intended to benefit local communities by reducing poverty, providing social support, strengthening livelihoods of communities. For many of these projects, however, the risks of harm to those same communities can be quite severe. And when harm does occur, accessing remedy also has presented significant barriers. Communities can face technical and logistical barriers. They can face governments that prioritize corporate interests over those of their citizens, and they can face really significant security threats. Independent accountability mechanisms, or IAMs, that are tied to international financial institutions offer an opportunity for communities to raise grievances related to those projects that are funded by the institution. And around the world, over 1,600 complaints have been filed with different accountability offices that are tied to development finance institutions. Iems are often the last and the only resort available to communities in the face of harm from development projects. And so they play a really important role in ensuring that communities have a voice in the development decisions that impact them. When we looked at the regional distribution of where complaints around the world are filed, we discovered that the Middle East and North Africa region has the lowest number of complaints filed of any region in the world. The MENA region has just 73 complaints distributed across 9 different countries, which is significantly less than the global average of 195 complaints per region. We wanted to look into why this finding was happening and try and understand what was going on in this region. One theory that we explored in this research as to why there are so few complaints in the MENA region is that there are also fewer projects about which to complain. But we found that even accounting for the reduced absolute number of projects, that the percentage of projects that have complaints remains lower than any region globally. The global average rate of complaints filed per project is 3.2%, and the MENA has the lowest rate of complaints filed per project at just 1.9%. In the Middle East and North Africa region, 2 in 3 eligible complaints reach a dispute resolution or a compliance review, which is the lowest engagement rate of any region in the world. We also found that the rate of complaints reaching outputs from the complaint process is low everywhere. And this is something that we at Accountability Council have seen over time, having worked on cases and supporting communities, as well as hearing from the experiences of our partner organizations that are supporting complaints around the world. And we know that globally, fewer than 1 in 5 complaints, or just about 18%, close with an agreement or a published compliance report. And in the MENA region, complaints face the second lowest rate of outputs of any region, with only 13% of complaints managing to reach an output from the complaint process. On average, globally, 69% of complaints that reach a dispute resolution stage are able to produce an agreement, compared to just 57% in the MENA region. And for compliance reviews, the comparison of outputs is even more stark. Globally, 82% of all compliance reviews result in a published public compliance report, and 83% of those reports have findings of non-compliance. However, in the MENA region, just 33% of compliance reviews produce a report, with a 66% rate of non-compliance found. These preliminary findings through our data analysis were quite alarming to us, and they pointed out really significant gaps in accountability and the limitations on opportunities for remedy for communities that are facing harm in the MENA region. In an effort to understand why these gaps exist and to understand the lived experiences of communities and those supporting organizations that are experiencing these issues, we spoke with nearly a dozen community groups and civil society organizations about their experiences in IAM complaint processes, specifically in the MENA region. And the collective results of these interviews were pretty staggering. Nearly every organization raised that the risk of retaliation was significant and threatening. And many organizations reported experiencing retaliation as a direct result of filing their complaint with an IAM. Organizations also reported that the resources required to engage in IAM processes were unreasonable and unsustainable. And when asked if they would file a complaint again, nearly every organization that we interviewed answered no. Other issues pointed out accessibility barriers, like language and translation requirements, lack of prior knowledge of Iems existing as a method for recourse, as well as the types of groups that are involved in supporting complaints, including the presence and extent of national and international civil society organizations. Interviewees also mentioned that IAM decision-making and independence, as well as really deeply imbalanced power dynamics, implicated the outcomes of complaints. As many of you working closely on these topics and within this field know well. Many of these limitations listed here are not, they're not inherent to the MENA region. They exist globally everywhere. However, what we did notice in our research is that these limitations have been exacerbated further when they've been compounded along other issues and factors that are prevalent in the MENA region, such as a weakened civil society, political instability, and the high risk of retaliation by the state. The sociopolitical context in the MENA region has weakened and suppressed civil society, including through longstanding and ongoing repression, war, retaliation, and corruption. The fear of retaliation is widespread throughout the region, and it serves as a barrier for communities and for project-affected people, and even third-party advocates to filing complaints. It was clear from our interview experiences that many communities and civil society organizations fear organizing against the interests of powerful political actors. And I mentioned earlier that retaliation was a significant concern for nearly every group that we spoke with that filed a complaint. And some groups experienced retaliation as a direct result of filing their complaint with an IAM. It is extremely likely then that the high risk of retaliation has suppressed complaints from being filed in the MENA region, meaning that harm is likely still occurring, but it is not being raised, which is resulting in the really low number of complaints that we're seeing in the region. It was also evident from our interviews that in part because of the suppressed and weakened state of civil society, that civil society organizations have very little capacity to support complaints. The suppression of civil society at large in the region has resulted in very few established civil society organizations that can operate. And even when those civil society organizations are granted formal registration to operate, they face remaining obstacles in being meaningfully involved and engaged in IAM processes, one of which is the costs of participation. Nearly all organizations that we interviewed agreed that the resources, the length of time, and the costs required to effectively and fully engage in IAM complaint processes were unsustainable. And on top of already very constrained funding, they've made it nearly impossible for those groups to engage again. I will now pass it over to Amy to share some of the insights and experiences of language and accessibility barriers, as well as the limitations to successful outcomes being reached for communities in IAM processes in the MENA region.
Thanks, Marissa. And before I start my presentation, I just want to make a note about the Arabic translation. I will say it in Arabic. في ترجمة للغة العربية متاحة تحت في الشاشة. في عندكم العلامة بتاعت الكرة الأرضية، لما هتدوسوا عليها هتشوفوا الترجمة للغة العربية. Thank you. So back to the presentation now. So Marissa talked about the different obstacles that prevent a complaint from the region. And I want to take some moment to start with, like, people, communities don't know who is funding the project. So not alone how to submit complaint. So most of the time they have a project, they are impacted by it, but they don't know who's funding. And in one of the stories I know that the communities, after looking for years who is funding a power plant next to their fields and farms, they thought it's a bank. They heard it's a bank, they thought it's a commercial bank. So they started to talk to a commercial bank to discover it's not the commercial bank. And when they discovered it's a World Bank, they called the World Bank by phone, and whoever replied to their phone call say, okay, noted, we will get back to you, never got back to them. This community was lucky enough that someone put them in touch with a well-known international organizations who had access to the World Bank. And that's why at the end, after years of searching, they got someone from the bank to talk to. But not all communities are that lucky. So first, they don't know who's funding because there is no note on the project saying who is funding. And B, if they know who's funding, they don't know how to approach it, or like they need connection to someone or some organization who have access to these funding institutions. So, and then when they want to submit a complaint, they don't know about the complaint. So back to the story I told you about the power plant and the farmers, they didn't know about the compliance mechanism. Again, it's this international organization who they were lucky enough that someone put them in touch with, who told them about the inspection panel in this case. So, and then when they go through the complaint after that, it's a very exhausting process. It's time consuming, it's financial resources consuming, it's everything. And they have to also calculate the cost benefit to submit the complaint. So they are taking risk, they are investing time and money and resources, and they're taking risk, like you saw from Marissa's presentation, that there is a fear of retaliation. So they need to make sure that it's worth it to take this risk and to invest the money and resources and time they need to. And not only that the community need to invest, but the civil society organizations who help the community, because most of the time the community cannot go alone through this exhausting process. They need the help of a civil society organization. And again, civil society organizations have limited resources. And when we speak about the capacity of civil society in the region, it's not that they don't have the capacity to do it. It's they don't have the resources to do it. They don't have the dedicated financial resource to have someone working on this. They don't have the time, and they are often exhausted by like trying to navigate their way in a very complex context in their countries. And you all know about the closing civic space in this region. So it needs dedication, and it needs really, really very well calculated cost benefit analysis. And then back to the cost benefit analysis. So if the examples that we have in the past, like from complaints that were submitted, none of them had a very good result at the end, good outcomes. So why people will take this risk and invest this time and money in it if they're not sure, or like the odds are they will not have a satisfying outcome. And I add to this the cultural barrier. Like in the region, most of the time, the IFIs, most of them willingly play the role of the scapegoat for the regimes. So you will find the IFIs have very bad reputation because sometimes mistakes are made by the regimes themselves. And sometimes the IFIs have nothing to do with these mistakes, but they are willingly playing the role of the scapegoat because in these countries, the regimes or the governments are the most important client, not the community. So the institution, to satisfy the clients, are willing to play this role. So there is this cultural barrier, no trust in the IFIs, let alone that those compliance mechanisms, yes, they are independent from the management, but they are still under the IFI. They report to the board. So they're still under this institution in which the communities don't trust. So it takes also a persuasion from the civil society organization who want to help them to tell them it's worth it. You will not be considered traitor if you submit your complaint to these institutions or these mechanisms. And to do so, I have to have very good example of good outcomes, so people are willingly taking this risk. But we don't have, there is no good example. And then we have also most of the time, why the complaint, like we have to see why the complaint do not have good outcomes. It's what I mentioned before, the long and exhausting procedures, but also most of the time it's very political. So out of the 9 complaints that were submitted to the inspection panel of the World Bank, and there were only 7 complaints. Only 5 were deemed eligible, but none of the 5 who are deemed eligible went to compliance review, because it's very political for many different regions inside this region. So this is all about my presentation. The information people don't know, the language barrier, the capacity in terms of resources available, the cultural barrier, and the most important thing is the lack of successful examples. So me as example, after some experiences with different compliance mechanisms in the region, I stopped encouraging communities to submit complaint unless they are the ones approaching me saying we want to submit, but I stopped trying to convince them to submit complaint because I don't want to raise their hopes for a process that at the end will not bring to justice. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Amy. And now we will hear from Rajia about the experience with Support Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, experience supporting the complaint to the CAO about the Titan Alexandria cement project in Egypt.
هتكلم بالعربي. صوتي مسموع؟ اوكي. شكرا للمجهود وللفرصة. مش هضيع وقت طويل لأن عندي كلام كتير. احنا قعدنا 6-7 سنين في الشكوى دي. أولا الشكوى بدأت فعلا زي ما إيمي قالت، هي اللي عرفتنا الطريق. فإحنا ما كانش عندنا فكرة عن الشكوى إلى CEO بتاع مؤسسة التمويل. تيتان ده مصنع أسمنت في اسكندرية، بينه وبين منطقة سكنية ضخمة 10 أمتار، والمنطقة شديدة التلوث، الهواء هناك وناس كتير مرضى.
Suffers from air pollution. This is a subject that was the focus of several other international organizations and the civil society organizations. Several complaints were filed locally, and this we were managed to compile experiences and information, and we reached out to Amy, who told us about an opportunity to file a complaint to the CAO, and we thought that would be a radical and more equitable solution, because the local litigation processes are equally difficult. We filed the complaint in April 2015, and the evaluation mission came in July 2015. This was a rather swift process, and we were hopeful. It conducted an assessment of the situation and tried to negotiate. The company refused negotiation and settlement, and the complaint was referred to compliance in 2016, where it remained until 2021 in the compliance department or compliance mechanism. An initial assessment was made, followed by another visit in 2017, in January 2017, and it took them 4 or 5 years to publish their report. What were the summary of the Ifc response? This complaint was environmental and focused on labor rights as well. The summary of the report can be summarized as follows. They reviewed the company's compliance and licenses, emissions, healthcare impact, and the employment conditions, the right to association and communication with civil society organization. The report focused primarily on the performance of
رغم إن
the IFC or the IFI. It examined the standards and meeting the standards prior to signing the contract and during the implementation. The report confirms that Titan did not meet the requirements. The emissions were 6 times higher than acceptable, and the IFC
الطويل إنه بيحاول يحسن الأداء، استغرق تحسين الأداء البيئي 4 سنوات أو 5 سنوات.
was convinced that Titan will improve and will reduce the emissions, even though that took around 6 years. The Titan's measuring process to prove its compliance with the requirements is not scientific, not methodological, and not done in the required locations to quantify the air quality in the area surrounding the cement company. This does not reflect the situation outside of the factory, when around 80% of the workers were working based on temporary contracts, which is a red line for the World Bank. A maximum of 25% should be on contractual or temporary basis, but the IFC did not conduct the required due diligence to make sure there are no cases of discrimination against temporary workers. The freedom of association was limited. Several workers' complaints were stifled. The police forces were brought in. Some people were badly affected from the protest. Even the occupational safety and health standards were not met and were insufficient. Regardless of all these issues, the contract remained, and no sanctions were taken against the cement company, and the agreement remained in force. I would like to be brief without going into more details. The summary of the CAO was subpar. There were 12 items and 12 recommendations that ought to find a solution. The IFI report included only 6 items, 4 related to disclosure, and what the factory should publish to state the steps it's taking to address the pollution. And the 6th recommendation was related to the IFC itself, confirming that it will conduct a study of the project review processes. With regards to the IFC had divested the project before the publishing of the results. Accordingly, they had said that they cannot oblige the company or the factory to do anything, but they can try to convinced them to meet the 6 recommendations that are basically useless. Unfortunately, the report confirmed that employment conditions were violated and the freedom of association was not granted. The report did not include any recommendations on the rights of the workers, which was strange.
مشكلة بقى يعني ايه الخلاصة اللي خرجت بيها من تجربتنا دي؟ أولاً الآلية نفسها
What can we draw from this experience? First of all, the mechanism is not widely known. It is quite difficult, and we needed to ensure an accumulation of information and experiences from the community, and we needed to seek expert support. This that the process was unfair and reinforced the company's position to put pressure on the people's opinions. The report is non-binding, and the IFC could have refused to acknowledge any item without and had the freedom to exclude it from the action plan. Therefore, the office became an internal mechanism in the IFC to try and amend their systems. They do not have the ability to put pressure on the IFC to develop an action plan, a responsive action plan. It does not provide any reparation or compensation. All these matters will not allow me to go through this experience ever again. Unfortunately, we had a phone call after the report was published with the lawyers from CAO to clarify a few points. They said that it is expected that the recommendations of the CAO should be approved by the IFC, otherwise they will not be included in the report and in the publication. Therefore, the process itself, in my opinion, is corrupt. Maybe it's only useful when it publishes a report, because they brought experts who explained to us some technical matters such as the emissions or levels of emissions and the reading of the emissions in the air. They provided us with few responses that are not related to people's rights, but to our own understanding of the problems that we faced, and we couldn't understand because we lacked the technical knowledge. Employees, workers were arrested, they lost their jobs, residents were suffering, a lot of them were incarcerated and were accused of terrorism and stirring instability. They were thankfully released later on. I'd like to say that the report talks about the attitudes of the IFC employees.
التصريح الرسمي كانوا يعتقدوا ان الدوافع لكده
They believed that the reasons were political.
ففي غضب كده عام ولا يتعلق فعلا بمشكلة
People were angry after the revolution,
ان في الاول
and they did not believe that
على الترخيص والاوراق القانونيه السليمه وقال في هذا مكتوب في
they had a legitimate cause
موجود بالعربي وقليل منها
because most of the reports were available in Arabic. They were not translated, and they thought that Titan's reputation was good enough when the factory told them that temporary workers are not allowed to or are denied their freedom of association. They did not believe them.
ودي حاجة مش كويسة خالص يعني
And this is bad, unfortunately.
معرفش ايه اللي المفروض يتعمل علشان الموظفين
I don't know what should be done in order for IFC employees to change their attitudes and to take into consideration a social dimension that allows them to respect their own standards instead of believing a company or a factory, or believing that these issues are the result of certain worries and certain complaints that emerged after the revolution. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Ragia. I would like to continue what you said. The IFC and its investment model is the following. It has a share of the capital. When Ragia said that they withdrew or they divested, she does not mean that they provided money for the company and they stopped, but they had a share of the capital in Titan. And when they noticed that there is a real issue, they divested from the company. They decided to sell their share to the mother company. Hence, Titan succeeded in regaining the share it had sold to the IFC, and the IFC says, since we do not have any share in Titan, then we do not have any reason to take any measures to coerce Titan to repair the situation. I'd like to say that currently there is a complaint against Titan Cement in Egypt and in Bani Suez. It was filed in 2017 and the report is yet to be published, and we reached the end of 2022. The report has not been published and the organizations that filed the complaints are no longer interested because they know that all they will hear is, we apologize, there's nothing we can do.
Hi, I'm Gemma, and I am also a research associate at Accountability Council. I'll just talk you through some of our recommendations today. But before I do that, can I please remind everyone to add any questions they have to the Q&A down the bottom. And once we are done with the recommendation section, we will move to the discussion. So my colleagues Marisa and Amy talked you through some of the issues that we've highlighted in the report that affect communities around the MENA region. Since IFIs and Iems have a responsibility to address and lessen harm related to their activities, we've included recommendations for banks and IAMs that would help address these underlying issues. I'll briefly touch on a few of these recommendations today. First, as mentioned by Marisa, fear of retaliation in this region is widespread. In order to address reprisal risks, we recommend both IAMs and IFIs should adopt zero tolerance policies and specific protocols on reprisals. They should also provide regular staff training on addressing and mitigating reprisal risks. Banks can also exercise their leverage in this area to prevent and respond to reprisals, for example, by suspending financing where appropriate. Second, as mentioned, communities and advocates also face capacity issues when engaging in complaint processes. For this reason, we recommend that IAMs provide direct funding to communities upfront to allow them to effectively engage in the complaint process. We also recommend that IAMs set out realistic expectations to communities of both the time it takes to engage, as well as the resources required to engage, so that both communities and advocates can make informed decisions about whether they take on complaints or not. The next recommendation I wanted to highlight is that of meaningful consultation. Consultation and disclosure issues relate to communities not being informed about a project, not being included or consulted about a project and its details, or not being invited to engage in project design. This is the most commonly raised issue in complaints to all IAMs and is an issue in the MENA region as well. Our recommendation is that IAMs and banks should adopt meaningful consultation practices early on, which means involving communities in decision-making processes prior to project details being solidified. This includes providing information to communities on consultation opportunities and disclosing project information in advance. Fourth, as mentioned by Amy, language barriers are prevalent in this region. IAMs and banks sometimes only provide relevant documents in English or don't make these documents publicly accessible. In order to lessen this barrier, we recommend that IAMs and banks should engage high-quality translators and translate their materials. They should also hire local consultants to address knowledge gaps and language barriers. Complaints to IAMs should also be allowed to be made in the preferred language of the complainant, and IAMs should have a corresponding budget to engage in that language through translation of documents and interpretation for meetings. Finally, I wanted to briefly mention remedy mandates. While some IAMs have monitoring mandates, the implementation of action plans, which are created by bank management, ultimately remain the responsibility of the bank alone. So although an IAM might find non-compliance, these findings are often non-binding and may not actually result in meaningful change for communities. Our recommendation is that IAMs should adopt mandates that allow them to recommend and enforce remedy. This would ensure that communities can access material remedy for harm. Remedy should be included in the planning process for every potentially harmful project, and a reserve remedy fund should be established at banks. Finally, banks should condition new funding to clients on the basis of providing remedy for prior harm, as verified by communities that have been harmed. I will pass this back to Amy, who will be discussing this point further.
Yeah, so most of the institutions, they have what they call the debarred companies list. And this is like all the companies or the clients who committed financial violations to the agreement, like corruption, financial violation to the financial terms in the agreement. These companies are in the debarred list of companies, and the debarment meaning like the institution will not deal with this client for a certain number of years. But the violation for the social and the environmental commitments, those are the things that really affect people's lives, are not punished. We understand that the compliance mechanisms, their role, their mandate is to hold the institutions, not the clients, accountable. Okay, but what about the client? The institution itself always shelters the client because it's the client. They need to do business with the client. It's only when it comes to financial violation when they stop making business with the client. And this sends a message that money is more important than people's lives. And this would be okay if it's a commercial bank, but with development bank, this like really very controversial here. So our recommendation is like these institutions should treat the violation to the commitment, social and the environmental commitment in the agreement the same way they treat the financial violations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. We will now move to our discussion section of this webinar. So please use the raise hand function to speak. And my colleague Madigan will, I believe she will ask you to unmute yourself and you can raise your question live. If you prefer to raise questions via chat or anonymously, you can continue to use the Q&A function on the webinar. And we will begin now. I believe we have a question from Rajia. Rajia, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
سوري أنا ما عملتش unmute صح؟
I forgot to unmute myself. I'm sorry. I think that remedy mandate amendment of the CAO is one of the top priorities, and it should define a time limit to provide resources and to increase the number of personnel. There should also be
إجبار يعني ده زي حكم إجبار على تنفيذ
a decision to ensure that the report results are implemented. Also, remedies should be provided and reparations should be provided to the persons who were affected. The IFCs are involved if they are providing financing and supporting the factory, and persons were higher than average for more than 6 years. People have died, others lost their jobs or were hospitalized. So these remedies should be provided. Second, with regards to the zero tolerance for retaliation, the forms of retaliation in our countries are indirect. They different accusations are made, such as drug use, for example, or they will not be allowed to apply for job vacancies. Maybe they will be arrested during a fight. There are different forms of retaliation and pressure that cannot be proven to have a direct relationship with the complaint. Therefore, we need to look for other remedies than zero tolerance, because zero tolerance is not sufficient. Natural community leaders are known. They help us to file complaints. They are known to the companies without mentioning their names in advance. I think that we need to think of preventive measures. Prior to signing any contract, maybe the IFC should meet with the community leaders during each and every visit. This might be one of the ideas, because it's not sufficient to say that we have a zero tolerance policy, because the names can be withheld. People can be incarcerated for fabricated reasons. They might be killed, they might be beaten.
Thank you, Rajia, for sharing. And yeah, we do agree that zero tolerance policies are are not enough. They're a start, but we do need more preventative measures to address the real risks that communities and civil society organizations face about retaliation and reprisals. I see that we have a couple other questions in the Q&A function about where folks can hear more about international financial institutions and independent accountability mechanisms, civil society organizations, and find out more about these recommendations. I will start with the last bit. We have published our report online. It's available here at the website lastononlyresort.com, as well as in Arabic at ar.lastononlyresort.com. We have a section dedicated to all of the recommendations that we've put together. The report is also available in downloadable formats, as well as translated into French. So we hope that you are able to read more about our recommendations there. And we're happy to follow up on any discrete conversations about what led us to some of these recommendations. In terms of more information on international financial institutions and independent accountability mechanisms, there's a plethora of information available. Each of these Iems do maintain their own websites and registries. They have their own information disclosures about how to access them. We at Accountability Council have also put together a guide on each of these mechanisms, what their complaint process is like, what sorts of stages that they do undertake. So some independent accountability mechanisms conduct both dispute resolution and compliance reviews, others just conduct compliance reviews. And so we've put together a guide. It's called the Accountability Resource Guide, and we will link that resource in the chat as well. And there are a number of other resources on our website as well related to how to access these different mechanisms and information related to their institutions. I hope that's helpful. And we will follow up with those resources shortly. I see another question in the Q&A about what alternatives exist for harmed individuals and supporting civil society organizations that choose not to go through Iems due to the many barriers. This is a really important question. I know that we touched briefly in our presentation about that there are very few alternatives to Iem processes, which is the part of the issue that communities face in the region, is that judicial processes and court processes can be really time intensive. They're also highly susceptible to very political decisions, and they're quite inaccessible for many people. And so these offices tied to international financial institutions are often the last and the only resort available to communities facing harm from development finance institutions. Amy,
sorry, Marissa, one thing, like we have an example from the region of a project that the communities were able to stop successfully, not because they went to the compliance, but because they were amazing and with their advocacy campaign. So it needs a lot of understanding on how the institution works, the ins and out, and how to do a full-fledged advocacy campaign as well.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you for touching on that. Any other remaining last questions that we can answer live? Please raise your hand and we can get to you. If not, or if you'd prefer to follow up anonymously or use follow up in discussion format with myself, Amy, Samer, Lema, Rajia, please feel free to email us. I've linked my email and Amy's email here, and we can follow up with you on any of your other questions or comments or feedback that you have for us, and we will reach back out to you shortly. We will be sure to share this recording of the presentation with all of you, and please do reach out if you have any questions or comments. We're excited to continue engaging on these topics and to get these recommendations really adopted at Iems and IFIs to address some of the barriers that we've discussed today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the work you are doing. Really, we need it. We really need it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajia. We appreciate your work as well. All right, well, that brings us to the hour. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited to continue discussing this topic with all of you. We'll follow up shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Hey.